interesting. So I'm not talking about you necessarily, but people. In other words, that's how calumny, because they embroider things, because they're bored, because they're lazy. The love of games, in other words, too much entertainment, like kids that are always playing games on the computer. That's a form of laziness. And so they're dumb, and they do bad things as a result. Gossip, as I said, theft, because you don't have any, if you're lazy, you don't work, and so you have to get what you need, so you steal it. That's why there's a lot of theft in areas where people don't work, or they're on welfare, or somehow dissipating all of their wealth. They steal. So in San Francisco, you can steal up to $1,000 worth of stuff and not get arrested. But that drove out a lot of the stores. So I don't know if they still have that rule. But that's how crazy things are there. But people come in and they steal $999 worth of stuff, and they go scot-free. That's due to laziness. People who work and have their own things don't steal, and buy their own things because they have money. They don't steal. It leads to intemperance, too much eating, too much drinking, because you're bored. You have nothing to do, so you eat. You sit around eating potato chips and Coca-Cola and various other things until you weigh 400 pounds. And your thighs look like ham hocks. It's true, there's people like that. You sit next to them on airplanes. And it's due to laziness. Laziness produces boredom. And boredom, as soon as boredom sets in, that anything can happen to entertain yourself. It leads to debauchery. You looking at dirty pictures and everything that follows from that. Typically masturbation. And it nourishes all the vices, and it leads to all of the excesses. So it's a very subtle vice. You see, it seems like, I think I'll take it easy, or it doesn't seem so bad. You see, impurity seems bad. Nobody has to tell you that's bad. And various others, faults, they are clearly bad. But the laziness doesn't seem so bad because there is a legitimate repose. So you have to sleep. You have to take breaks once in a while so that you don't go crazy. Some people can overdo it. You can sin the other way by being too active and taking on too much and getting nervous and nasty and so forth. You can do that too. Virtue is always in the middle between two opposites, either defect or excess. So it has an aspect of good to it. You see, that I should take some rest, but then you can overdo it, and all sorts of things happen, especially the boredom. Don't forget the 3 ways to be lazy is, first, to remain idle, 2, not to do what you ought to be doing. So you're doing something else. You're entertaining yourself in a very busy way, but doing something that you want to do, but not what you ought to do. Very subtle way of being lazy. See, sports, but you don't take care of your family or something like that, or it could be any kind of hobby or distraction that takes you away from what you should be doing. That's very subtle. And the third is to do badly what you do. See, so you should, in your examination of conscience, you should think about all of those things. In other words, did I lie around too much today? Did I take too much rest? Did I fail to do what I should do? How did I use time today? Remember, St. Alphonsus took a vow never to waste time. How did I use the time today? And did I do well what I was supposed to do? Whether it's the dishes, whether it's studying, anything else, did I do well what I was supposed to do? Those are the questions you ask, and I think you'll find out, a lot. If you look at the day, you'll think, well, I didn't use my time perfectly. There were cases where I sinned, usually venially in those things, but nonetheless, venial sin is not something to be taken lightly, in the sense that it can lead easily to worse things, and even mortal sins easily lead if they're not suppressed and if you don't fight against them. Right? So this is, as I said, a subtle vice that leads to many other things. St. Basil said, just as worms are born in softer wood, so the impiety of the mind arises in the minds of softer men, meaning lazy people. St. John Chrysostom said, there is no virtue, however easy it is to practice, which laziness does not make very painful and almost impossible to practice. Very true. The idea of exerting yourself is just so unbearable for the lazy person. To pray, for example, to do spiritual reading, to go to Mass, I just can't do it. When you get into a serious habit of laziness, everything that involves work or some kind of effort is disgusting to you, no matter what it is. That's when you're addicted to laziness. And don't think that as priests you would be exempt of that. That can happen to you. St. John Chrysostom also said, the idleness of Adam was the cause of his fall, and he would not have fallen if he had been busy. That's what he said. St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, laziness provides asylum for the devil. It is the source of all evil thoughts and of every sin. Plunged into the torpor of idleness, the lazy are nourished by sin. So idleness and sin go hand in hand. St. Cyril said, what else is idleness than to irrevocably waste time? Irrevocably, because time goes by and it never comes back again. It will never return. It's very precious in that sense, to use time well. He continues, the pouring out of life, in other words, wasting your life, when you could be doing something constructive and something that obviously pertains to your spiritual life. Just wasting time that is given to you by God for the purpose of the sanctification of your soul, just throwing it away. So it's the pouring out of your life and the backward movement of him who is making progress. So if laziness sets into someone who is making progress, he starts to go back, meaning in the spiritual life. He continues, laziness engenders the softness of the flesh, engenders pride, and kindles lust, unbinds the tongue. Again, because you have nothing to do, you talk about stupid things or talk about other people. He says it nourishes poverty and leads to stealing. All these saints say the same thing, that it is the home of all kinds of vices. It leads to every single possible vice you can think of. Laziness. In Proverbs it says, he that follows idleness shall be filled with poverty, obviously. The lazy man stifles his conscience. He dissipates his wealth. See, so he spends whatever he has until he has nothing. He loses his health, probably eating too much, those potato chips, everything that RFK would probably condemn, all right? The French fries and whatnot, greasy French fries. So you lose because you are bored and you want entertainment. So the idea of saying eating a big bowl of ice cream versus eating a raw carrot, which one are you going to take? Which is more entertaining? Because you're just bored. See? He loses his reputation because you have the reputation of being lazy. Who wants that? And he loses his life. This is all. The lazy are often braggarts. They brag because they want to, in a way, build themselves up, even though they're nothing. And while preserving their hands from activity, they make their tongues work. See, so they talk a lot. Very, very subtle, but we might say productive vice. It's productive of all kinds of other sins. St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, the lazy life is the mother of frivolities and the stepmother of virtues. Now, stepmother means somebody who is not really your mother, but who, like in a marriage of the second time, where the original mother dies, there's a stepmother. And they have a reputation for not being nice to the children of the first marriage. So that's why he says that. It's a stepmother. In other words, somebody who is, sometimes they're very nice. But that has, when somebody says that, that means that it's usually somebody that is unpleasant. So the stepmother of virtue, in other words, somebody that does not foster virtue. That's what he means by that. Those who are lazy are curious, gossipy, and often liars. They embroider things. They embroider to make themselves more interesting. And while doing nothing, they are concerned about the actions of others. So they look at what other people are doing, and they typically criticize it. They are very, very anxious to find out the news. See, so they're all over the internet, constantly looking at the news, but they also want to know all of the gossip of the neighborhood or the gossip of the community. Did you hear this? Did you hear that? Because they're not busy. They want entertainment. They're bored. They have little care for things. In other words, if the whole place is falling apart, they don't care. If the room is messy or anything like that, they don't care. Or dirty, they don't care. Just have no cares. As I said, they tend to mock people. They establish themselves as the judges of everyone and consider themselves to be more able than anyone else. It's all a front, a type of mask that they put on. St. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians, "For we have heard that there are some among you who walk disorderly, working not at all, but curiously meddling." St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, he wrote a whole treatise on laziness. He says that the cold of laziness, if once it enters the soul, a rigor of the mind sets in, like a paralysis of the mind, and its strength slows down. It pretends to have no more strength. It perceives austerity with horror. So any kind of austerity that is suggested to it is absolutely horrible. It gives rise to a fear of poverty. The mind is diminished. Time seems long because they're not doing anything, so they're bored and time is tedious to them. Reason is put to sleep. Grace is taken away from him. The first fervor is diminished. The intelligence is extinguished. A contemptuous lukewarmness develops. Fraternal charity grows cold. Pleasure becomes alluring. Security is falsified. Habit prevails. What else? It goes on. He said, the law is disregarded. The rule is set aside. Duty is proscribed. In other words, the last thing you'd ever think of doing is what you should be doing. The fear of the Lord is abandoned. This is still St. Bernard. Finally, one becomes impudent, and this rash person who hastens to his destruction, this man covered with shame, full of ignominy and confusion, becomes presumptuous. Then he falls from the heights of virtue into the abyss of vice, from a clean path into a sewer, from a throne into a cesspool, from heaven to earth, from the cloister to the world, from paradise to hell. That's what St. Bernard thinks about laziness. He was against it. In Proverbs we read, because of the cold, the sluggard will not plow. He shall beg therefore in the summer, and it shall not be given to him. It also says, every sluggard means lazy person, is always in want, meaning they don't have anything that they need. And so they have to beg or in some way steal, either one. Another from Proverbs, I passed by the field of the slothful man and by the vineyard of the foolish man, and behold, it was all filled with nettles, weeds, and the thorns had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall was broken down. So an image of the lazy man, the field. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux said, just as through a crack in the ship's hold, that means it's underneath, we're usually below the water level, water slowly enters and increases until the ship sinks through the negligence of the sailors, so from leisure and laziness, evil thoughts and desires are multiplied until the ship of the heart, succumbing to them, is in danger of sinning. St. Lawrence Justinian said, just as stagnant water in a swamp becomes corrupt, becomes unusable for use for living things, and becomes filled with tiny animals and poisonous reptiles, so the lazy body contracts filth and finds itself given to carnal desires, which makes the soul lose its sense of what is just and right. So it's true, you lose your conscience, as your conscience becomes so lax as to what is right and true and just, etc., that you just are incapable of making a good judgment. Everything is leisure and no work, and that I don't want to be disturbed. That is the idol, so to speak, and everything must submit to that. That's laziness. In Proverbs, he that pursues idleness is very foolish. St. John Chrysostom says, he who is voluntarily lazy speaks and acts very often in a rash manner. Rash means that without thinking and without prudence. He does nothing the whole day. He has a mind loaded with sluggishness and lethargy. What everybody else is saying. He also said, the same saint, St. John Chrysostom, laziness brings ignorance and an overflow of evil thoughts. It expels good thoughts, good desires, enlightenment, grace, virtue, and every good thing. St. Peter Chrysologus said, through laziness, man makes his gifts of nature useless, that is, the faculties of the soul, the benefit of reason, the superiority of his intelligence, the judgment of his mind, his aptitude for the arts, and his education. All of that becomes useless. He refuses to the Creator the fruit which all these things should bear, and the recognition which ought to follow them. So any kind of merit, whether in this life or in the next, are rendered null. Merit, like a sterile tree, is cut down and thrown into the fire. So that he bears no merit. He doesn't merit anything, and he's just like a dead tree. If he is a man of state, in other words, a statesman, he essentially harms society. So if he does not take care of what he should do as a statesman, then it harms all society. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, one must fear rest in rest. In other words, if you're resting, fear that you're not resting too much. That's what that means. One must fear rest in rest. That is, you must regulate the amount of rest which you take and not to abandon yourselves to it. We should offer rest to God, changing rest into virtue, because that's what you should be doing. In other words, if you order yourself correctly, that's what you should be doing at that time. Just as you do with your meals, this is St. Bernard, your sleep, and everything else you do. So there's a certain amount of sleep you should get, a certain amount of food you should eat, etc., and the right food, etc. Go back to those potato chips and those French fries. So...